A former advisor of Ronald Reagan has some choice words for George W. Bush. David Stockman, Reagan's budget director from 1981 to 1985, slammed Bush and his former boss in an op-ed in the New York Times on Sunday. Stockman argued in the piece that Reagan's view on the deficit, quote, created a template for the Republicans' utter abandonment of the balanced budget policies of Calvin Coolidge. He continued that the deficit policies allowed George W. Bush to dive into the deep end, bankrupting the nation through two misbegotten and unfinanced wars, a giant expansion of Medicare, and a tax-cutting spree for the wealthy that turned K Street lobbyists into the de facto office of national tax policies. Is it unusual, to have like a Reagan guy backing Bush, trashing Bush?
Yeah, as a big Reagan guy, yeah, I think David Stockman's been kind of beating this drum for about a decade, actually, though not quite as loudly as he did in this piece for the New York Times. He's I think the most consistent and the most honest person from the sort of we can't afford it, America is broke school of thought on monetary economics. I think there are some legitimate critiques of this framework in general, but if you accept the framework, there are certain things that cost money that the government has to spend, and that these things contribute to a large deficit. In particular, he's looking at war and at Medicare Part D, which is a program allowing paying for prescription drugs for senior citizens under Medicare. These are expensive things for a lot of different reasons. But they could be cheaper if you wanted to tweak them, but they would still be very large programs and they cost a lot of money. That's what drove the big expansion of the federal deficit over the last couple of years. That and then a huge financial crash, which has cost a lot of money to clean up. And it's really hard to pin those policies on Democrats because Democrats weren't in power when they were enacted. I think one thing that's really interesting about Stockman's worldview, though, is that he does not agree with Democrats on how best to get out of this type of mess.
Well, that's what's interesting, right? They share the critique of Bush. They share the critique of that he abandoned a certain type of policy position. But then when it comes time to dig out, Democrats are saying, well, we need to invest in certain areas. We need to create long-term development, and we still need some tax cuts. Right?
Yeah, and David Stockman is just sort of like a universal pessimist here. I mean, he does not share the Republican Party's current predilection for taking all of this out on the poor through the Paul Ryan budget, for instance. He's very aggressively critical of that in the piece, saying we should not be trying to fix the deficit by balancing the books on the backs of our neediest citizens. But he also just doesn't fundamentally believe in Keynesian economics. He doesn't think that when you get into a liquidity trap like this, when everybody stops spending money, that the way to fix it is to have the government spend more money. He thinks that just makes the problem worse in the long run. And so this is someone who he basically thinks that we're going to have this slow play out of fiscal Armageddon. That there's really no way to actually get out of this, which I don't think is a particularly plausible view. But I think he is right that the lack of action in Washington, combined with the very aggressive action from the Federal Reserve right now, could be setting the stage for some sort of asset bubble in the future, which we would not be as prepared to deal with fiscally as the last one. But at the same time, I think someone like Paul Krugman is theoretically equipped to offer a just as plausible, if not more plausible.
I was going to say, and his vision is obviously one that says investment right now actually makes some sense. Spending right now makes some sense.